When it comes to sightings of UFOs and alien beings, there is no case in America more famous than that of the Roswell incident. I probably don't even need to explain it to you, just because of how well known it is, but I'll give a brief summary anyways. The day was July 8th, 1947, and the location was obviously Roswell, New Mexico, when a local newspaper would release the headline, "Roswell Army Airfield Captures Flying Saucer." Apparently, there had been metallic and rubber debris recovered by the Army from a nearby ranch. The story was not only made news in the US, but all over the world it went viral, or as much as viral could be back in those days. And strangely, the very next day, the story was redacted, and then later on, it was said it was nothing more than a conventional weather balloon. In fact, after this, it would come out that the balloon was part of the top secret Project Mogul, which was intended to use balloons to detect Soviet nuclear tests. Case closed, right? Well, as you already know, this would not be the case, and the actual story of what happened that day is still unknown, because although the government's official stance is still, it was nothing more than a balloon, many people within the military and government have came forward to speculate that it was more than that. In fact, 30 years later, retired Air Force officer Jesse Marcel came forward and claimed that the balloon story was nothing more than a cover story, and that the debris was actually of extraterrestrial origin. 2 years later, this became a huge fixture in American pop culture with the release of a book called The Roswell Incident, which has since led to the belief that Roswell really seen a UFO crash that also included aliens, and depending on what story you believe, possibly even alien corpses and autopsies, and even culminating in reverse engineering of the flying saucers themselves. It became so popular that 50 years after the crash in the 1990s, the US Air Force finally published reports which showed Project Mogul was officially responsible for the crash and that there was no alien cover-up. Regardless, many people still believe it was in fact a UFO crash. But this is the Obscure series, and here we try to tackle the more unknown mysteries and theories, right? So where does this one take a bizarre turn? Well, that actually comes from the Soviet Union, when Joseph Stalin, who reigned from 1929 until 1953, apparently ordered an investigation into what the Americans knew about the UFO phenomenon, and especially the 1947 Roswell crash. Which makes sense too, because the Soviets likely suspected it was more than a weather balloon, and probably was interested in knowing exactly what this balloon was for. Likewise, if it was really a UFO, they would want to know that too. And we know all of this because of one key person, a man named Valery Burdakov, who holds a doctorate in engineering science and was professor at the Moscow Aviation Institute. He personally worked on many of the Soviet Union's ballistic missiles as well as their space program. And it's during this time, Professor Burdakov worked with another man named Dr. Sergei Koryalov, the top aeronautics expert and the Soviet head of rocket science in the 40s and 50s. According to Burdakov, Sergei was actually the one ordered to review the crash site at Roswell. Unfortunately, he would pass away in 1966, but Burdakov would begin doing a series of interviews in the 1990s where he revealed these details. One interview in particular was that of UFO researcher, journalist, and coast-to-coast anchor George Knapp, whom he met with in 1992. He would reveal that Stalin not only ordered Sergei to look at the UFO issue in general, but he ordered him to specifically review news clippings and broadcast transcripts about the Roswell crash and intelligence reports from Russian agents who had investigated the crash. And don't forget, New Mexico was home to a lot of Russian spies at the time due to nuclear testing going on at the area. It would actually be the year following Roswell that Sergei was summoned to the Kremlin and was given an office apartment with access to translators and began going over as many documents about the crash as he could find. After some time of studying whatever he could get his hands on, he turned over his report to Stalin, in which he stated it was his estimate that 1. UFOs did not belong to any foreign power, 2. The UFO phenomenon was real, 3. They did not, however, represent a threat to the security of the state, and finally, 4. They should be afforded further serious study. Stalin, unconvinced, would then bring in other scientists and assign them to the same task, and was surprised when they came back with the very same conclusion. These men were some of the top scientists of the Soviet Union at the time, and not known to embellish the facts. After this was told to Stalin, he advised Sergei to not discuss anything he had learned about the matter with anyone else, and we didn't even find out about him until the 1990s, when his name started popping up in magazines which covered the unexplained. And it was strictly due to him that Professor Burdakov also became interested in the unexplained. But is any of it true? Well, first, we have to look at one of the big facts in this one. Russian-born operatives were known to be very active in New Mexico at this time, especially near the military and the national laboratory facilities and test sites. This included the Los Alamos National Laboratory, Alamogordo Test Site, and Sandia National Laboratories. And it's very likely they would have passed along what they knew about the Roswell crash, especially considering when it became worldwide news that a UFO had crashed and was recovered. The Soviets would have feared any extraterrestrial technology being reverse engineered and used against them, so it's almost certain Stalin made Roswell the agent's top priority. And the Russians' intelligence gathering inside the states at this time was insane. The spies had been trained extensively to blend in as an everyday normal American and rarely were detected. Because of that weakness, the spies would have had no problem getting what info they needed. So now we know they had the means, and we know they were in the right location, and we know it would have been considered a top priority of the Soviet government. But do we know if the Soviets actually had any real proof that the US recovered an alien spacecraft in Roswell? Well, when this story got popular in the 90s, one UFO researcher, a Dr. Richard Haint, who had also worked for NASA, tried to build a group that combined both Russian and US UFO investigators, and one of their top aims was to find out what the Soviets actually knew about Roswell. In Dr. Haint's research, he found that the Soviet archives contained no such documents that detailed Stalin's UFO files. When he asked the Russian UFO researchers, they could find nothing either. However, they came to the conclusion that these secret files were handed over to the US intelligence services during their political reforms of the 80s in the Soviet Union. However, one thing to remember in all this is, the story basically comes from one man, Professor Burdakov, who began giving interviews on it in the 90s. We never actually heard from Sergei since he was dead for close to 30 years at that point. While it don't mean it wasn't true, it's just hard to validate without any kind of document supporting it. For this next one, we go back to one of our most visited websites, the forums of Forteana.org, where a user would tell a story that happened to him back in 1973 when he was 8 years old. He would recall that it was a Sunday afternoon in Essex, UK, and he was out with his dad, mom, and sisters blackberry picking so his mom would have enough berries to make a few pies. He would recall that the rest of the family had become interested in some of the more berry-rich bushes, and he got bored and wandered away about 80 feet or so. He would then crouch down in front of these big hedges and bushes where he spotted a gap in the foliage. So the young boy leaned over and looked inside, and what he seen would shock him. There, in the middle of this bush, was this huge web made of strands that looked sorta like steel wire, and sitting inside was the biggest spider he had ever seen. He estimated it was about 4 feet from tip to tip, and he described it as being brown with patches of pink coloring. He began shouting at his parents to come over and look, but they were so focused on the berry picking that they blew him off. He would finish by saying the moment had been burned into his memory, and for all those years he tried to rationalize what it was that he saw. He wondered if he had really seen a giant spider, or maybe something else altogether. Thankfully for his sake, he had an interesting reply that seemed to confirm his story. The poster would tell him he wasn't alone, because he had witnessed the same exact thing. He would state his sighting took place in Manchester, about a 4-hour drive away, and that he was 10 years old when it happened, although He didn't list a year. According to his tale of events, the story began one day when he happened to notice a large rusty brown bundle that sat in some lower branches of a neighbor's tree where it met the trunk. He would walk over to look, to see exactly what it was that he was looking at. But when he got close, he seen a giant spider, and it was brown colored, about 3 foot in size, and had pink patches on it. Its legs held tightly to its body, and it looked like it was crouched up. He recalled being scared, but intrigued. Since this sat on the front lawn, he just happened to see his friends playing out in the street and neighboring yards and called for them to come look, which they did, but they did not seem to be too interested and went back to playing. The boy, not wanting to give up yet, would go knock on his neighbor's door, the same neighbor whose yard this tree was sitting in, and he told them what was living in their tree, and the neighbor basically made fun of him for it. He then said it was probably poisonous and to leave it alone. He didn't even go look at it. So the boy let it go, but he did come back a few days later to try and poke the thing with a stick. He stated it was heavy and did not budge. After this, he got too spooked out and stopped. But crazily enough, the following day, a neighbor who lived 2 doors down had a dog end up disappearing. And this dog was not the type to wander the neighborhood, and it greatly upset the owner. The author of the post wondered ever since if the two events were connected. He closed up his post by saying he had told the story to a few people over the years, but was always ridiculed for it, and people always believed he was lying or imagined the whole thing. But now he wondered if the two had seen the same exact thing. He believed if it was, it had to be a creature that moved during the night, and probably didn't move much at all, opting to stay in the spot for as long as it could, trying to keep out of sight. Now I tried to find more on the giant spiders in the UK mystery, but unfortunately didn't find much. Although the great raft spider, which was once endangered in the UK, has started making a comeback in the past decade. But even these spiders at their biggest only get up to around 10 inches, a far cry from the 3-foot arachnid the posters on Fortiana claim to see. So what was it? Of course, it very well could have been an attempt to troll the users on that board, but it could have also been just the wild imagination of a young child who seen something else. Or it's possible pareidolia was to blame. You know, the tendency for the human brain to see patterns. Maybe what they thought was a spider was nothing more than foliage and webs. Of course, maybe they really discovered a new species of spider. So this next one involves an obscure conspiracy that is connected to a mystery I previously covered. That one was about the unsolved murder of a young woman named Mary Rogers, or also known as the Cigar Girl. It was covered in the Historical Mysteries and Oddities Part 2 video, and I will put a link up now and highly recommend you go watch that before you watch this. However, if you're busy with something else, or laying down, or just don't want to click away, I will give a brief summary of that mystery for those who have never heard it, and then we'll get to the obscure conspiracy. Mary Cecilia Rogers, a strikingly beautiful young woman, became a sensation in New York City in the early 1840s when she took a job at John Anderson's cigar shop, drawing attention and customers alike. After mysteriously disappearing for 6 days, in January 1841, she returned home but seemed emotionally changed, providing vague answers about visiting relatives. Rumors soon spread about her involvement with a naval officer, and she quit her job at the cigar shop. By July, she was engaged to a man named Daniel Payne, but her sudden disappearance again in late July led to a widespread search and tragic discovery. Mary's body was found brutally mutilated near the shore, sparking a media frenzy and public outrage. Several theories about her murder circulated, including accounts of her being seen with a gang of rough men and a well-dressed, dark-complexioned man resembling the officer she had been seen with before. Witnesses placed her at Hoboken on the day of her death, and conflicting reports emerged about her final hours, which brought about various leads, including items found near the crime scene. Mrs. Loss, a local innkeeper, later suggested Mary had died from a botched abortion, though this contradicted the coroner's report of foul play. The case remains unsolved, with suspects including the naval officer, her fiancé Daniel Payne, who later committed suicide, and even her former employer, John Anderson. Speculation swirled about the involvement of other men in a possible cover-up. The case even inspired Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Mystery of Marie Roget, the first fictional crime tale based on a real-life event, cementing the tragic mystery of Mary Rogers in literary history. Now let's pick it up there. It may not surprise you, or it may, that this conspiracy actually suggests that Mary was murdered by none other than Edgar Allan Poe himself. See, the short story contained many accurate details about the murder not known by the general public at the time, which of course begs the question, just how did he know this? But in researching this conspiracy, and from previously covering the topic, the case was so infamous at the time, and police procedures were so different, and because of that, many of the details were leaked to the press. So considering Poe was said to be obsessed with the case, and he scanned the papers every day for facts about it, then it's completely plausible that he took what was known about it, changed her name and the location the story took place, and his fictional account was done. His theories about what really happened were just that, guesses on the available evidence. The police at the time did even state that his theory was probably correct, although they did point out he never named a suspect. So where does this one come from? Strangely, there's not a lot about it, except for a couple of key things. First, goes back to that cigar shop where Mary quickly became the attention of many men in the surrounding area. These men included such famous names as James Fenimore Cooper, author of The Last of the Mohicans, Washington Irving, author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and of course, Edgar Allan Poe, who also dropped in to see her. Adding more speculation would come via a book written by author Irvin Wallace, best known for his heavily researched novels, and in a book called The Fabulous Originals, Lives of Extraordinary People Who Inspired Memorable Characters in Fiction. He would write that one of the top suspects was Edgar Allan Poe, and he would cite one very specific reason for this. According to him, during his research, he found that Poe had went and met John Anderson, the man who had opened the cigar shop and hired Mary. According to him, Poe began discussing Mary's murder with him while he was in the midst of researching for his fictionalized account of her murder. And I guess from this, he had told John all these details about it that no one else knew at the time, or at the very least, John didn't know about it. This is basically the only reference I can find for this conspiracy, and at best, it's a bit of a stretch. Although I was able to find other sources that stated that even at the time, there were strong rumors that John Anderson himself paid Edgar Allan Poe $5,000 to write the story in hopes that it would distract everyone from looking at him, because at the time, he was considered a suspect too, definitely to the public. John would even go to his deathbed, telling his loved ones that Mary's ghost had haunted him for decades. We now go to the paranormal section of the About.com website, where we find our next bizarre tale. This story begins in October of 1981, with the location being Atwater, California, when two young brothers were visiting their cousin. At some point, the three would decide to leave the home and head outside to do some exploring in the area, as they knew nearby was an old single-story abandoned brick building where equipment was once stored. It's here they decided to walk in and take a look around. The building was long and divided into 4 rooms with no windows and only one door per room. They slowly walked inside, checking every room, and come to find out, they were all empty. The brothers had fun anyways, telling ghost stories and writing on the walls with chalk. It was at the last room of the hall they spent the most time, and the older brother who was telling the story, and is also unnamed, would tell his younger brother to go back down the hall to the first room and get his comb, because he thought he dropped it there. So his brother did as told and walked down the very long hall to the first room to search for the comb. Meanwhile, the older brother and cousin walked outside and sat down in the grass next to a ditch near the building. That's when the older brother spotted his comb, as it had fell out of his shirt pocket, so he yelled for his younger brother to come on as he had found it. Yet, no reply. He waited around 10 minutes and called back out for him again, and still no reply. This led to both brother and cousin yelling for him before giving up and walking back towards the building. As they made their way, he was stunned to see his little brother emerging from the last room, right where the older brother and cousin had been previously. He was now confused on how he even made it there without either one of them seeing him. But there was more to worry about as his brother was crying with this confused look on his face. He then collapsed to the ground. The older brother was now scared and didn't know what to do, so he and his cousin rushed over to pick him up. He then asked him how he even got in that last room without passing them, but his brother went into sort of a mild seizure and said something about a hole in the floor that was getting bigger, as well as a hole in the wall. While relaying this, he started to cry uncontrollably as the two tried to comfort him. Soon his brother became completely silent and seemed to just stare into the distance. They took him back to his cousin's house and told his mom what had happened, and she got very upset. The older brother and cousin went back to the building and searched all the rooms and found nothing unusual. But after this is when the mystery really starts, because his little brother up to that point had been very outgoing, friendly, and talkative. But after this incident, he was now withdrawn, quiet, and perpetually nervous. Even after maturing and becoming an adult, he continued to live with his mother because he couldn't even concentrate to do simple tasks. He couldn't even dress himself, so his mother had to help. That's pretty much it to this story. The author, as far as I know, never offered a follow-up, and since it was posted by paranormal researcher Stephen Wagner, it's difficult to say who originally reported it to him. But let's take a look at some of the theories, shall we? Let's get the obvious one out of the way first. Stephen Wagner was given a purely fictional account which never happened. With that one out of the way, let's take a look at the rest. The main paranormal theory is his little brother accidentally stumbled into a portal, an unfortunate portal, one he entered and went out of our reality only to return horribly changed by what he witnessed, which must have been some kind of traumatic event. Or it's even possible he was replaced by someone or something else. This one would make a little sense considering the brother described seeing a growing hole, which may have been temporarily a tear between dimensions. Looking at the more down-to-earth theories, it's possible that he had experienced a reaction called sudden traumatic stress, which can happen after having a life-threatening event. But there was no life-threatening event in that room since it was completely empty, right? Well, it's possible he imagined the whole thing, which could have been indicative of a mental illness. Of course, this doesn't explain how he was seemingly transported across the building into another room. Morgan County, Kentucky. Sometime around the year 1900, a man known as French Ferguson was walking down the road about midnight. Where he was going and where he came from, as well as other details, are lost to time. However, what's important is what happened next, because as he was walking by this hollow, or known colloquially as Holler, he would hear a noise that startled him. So French stopped and looked and listened. While he was scanning the horizon, looking for any kind of movement, he soon seen a white figure coming up out of the holler. He continued to watch it as it made its way closer and closer. Soon he realized it was a man without a head. And before French could even turn to run, the being got closer and faded away, vanishing into the midnight air. It would be for years after this strange occurrence that the locals would begin seeing strange moving lights around the area at night. This story was collected in a book called Ghosts Across Kentucky, written by William Linwood Montell. And whoever told him this story would go on to say that later on, his parents decided to build a house at the mouth of the holler, and the neighbors all came to them and begged them to stop, claiming that the so-called Booger lived up in a rock cliff above where their house was being built. However, his parents continued with the construction, and soon after this, the lights disappeared and so did the Booger. The author closed by stating these two weird occurrences is what led to the name of this area, Haint Holler. And you may be asking yourself, what is a haint? Haint is simply an alternate spelling of haunt, and it's often used to describe a ghost or evil spirit in the South. And knowing that, what do we make of this weird unexplained phenomena? Well, it was actually put on this iceberg because of its comparisons to two different type cryptids. First was obviously a Sasquatch, and if you watch the Southern series, you will know people in the Commonwealth of Virginia call their Sasquatch Wood Booger, and Morgan County, where this story takes place, is in eastern Kentucky, and although it's closer to West Virginia than Virginia, you could easily see how the term booger for Sasquatch might stretch over into this area as well. However, the creature in this story was described as being solid white, whereas the wood booger of Virginia is described as being brown, although there is the occasional reporting of an albino Sasquatch. Next is the theory that it might have been an albino ground sloth, which is an animal that has been extinct for a long time, but reportings still pop up like crazy, and many of those in North America. Regardless, in either case, it's odd that the lights seen in the area disappeared along with the creature after the house was built, which obviously means there's some kind of connection between the creature and the lights, which suggests it might be more spirit related than cryptid. In isolated rural areas of Appalachia, especially in places like Hollers, which is just a little rural neighborhood inside a valley or ravine, ghost stories are pretty common. Areas like this are often filled with the forest area, cliffs, and winding roads, which makes it a bit spookier. This leads me to the final theory, and this is one based on my own experiences. I grew up in an area similar to the location of this story, and I've been to many hollers, and although where I grew up was not called a holler, it was basically an unofficial one. And why this matters is, I heard this same exact story when I was little. Even though I'm not close to Morgan County where it takes place, I am in Appalachia, in the general region where it occurred, and I heard this story before this book even came out in the early 2000s. The only difference being, the white headless figure in the holler was on a white ghost horse, and it was often told that the holler used to be a logging trail where something bad happened to this ghost. So considering I heard the same tale before it was even collected in this book, I have to chalk the whole thing up to good old Appalachian folktales. If you have followed this channel for a while now, you will know I have a heavy interest in history, and to be specific, the exploration period, which started with Columbus and, depending on the source, ended around the 17th century. And although most of the world had been explored by then, there were still the obvious places that man had never seen, like Antarctica, Australia, New Zealand, the innermost parts of America and Canada, and of course, deep within the Amazon. And that's where this story starts at, deep in Brazil, in a state called Mato Grosso, meaning thick bush. The area is pretty remote and holds only a little over 1.5% of Brazil's population, in spite of the fact that it's the third biggest state. That might be because the land that it encompasses, which consists of the Amazon, the Cerrado, a tropical savanna, and the Pantanal, a tropical wetland sorta like the Everglades, actually the largest one in the world. And this doesn't even account for the natives that for the longest time attacked anyone wandering into the area, even in the early 20th century, or the various tropical diseases and dangerous animals. And it might be because of the mystery surrounding this land, some have suggested something important is hidden there. Many Hollow Earth believers actually think this area has access points that connect to the Hollow Earth, where white Indians live and prehistoric beasts roam around in the swamps. Heck, even the famous Percy Fawcett believed the lost city of Z was located here, and Fawcett, as you already know, vanished in this area and was never seen again. But he's not the only explorer to come look for this subterranean city. Fawcett, before his own exploration, was granted access to historical documents archived in Rio de Janeiro, and he found as early as 1734 a Portuguese expedition that took place in a large mountain range with the goal of finding silver and gold. They came up on a small crack in one of the mountains, and they started crawling through it. When they came out on the other side, they discovered an enormous city. Unfortunately, the buildings here appeared to have been devastated by an earthquake, and huge blocks of granite that had fell from the buildings lay around the area. The explorers also found a sacrificial altar made of gold, hieroglyphics, and strange faces carved into stone. Further exploration led into finding gold coins laying all around the ruins, and they also found several underground shafts on the outside of the city. They decided to rush back to civilization and tell everyone what they had found, but before they could leave, they encountered two men among the ruins. They had white skin and long black hair and wore robes, and the party stopped to talk to these two men. But meanwhile, they sent one of the native runners they brought with them back to tell Brazilian authorities what they had found, and he made it there and relayed the news. But long story short, this expedition crew was never seen again. There were other expeditions to the area as well, but we're going to discuss the one that landed on this iceberg, that of the expedition led by Senor Medellin. This comes from a Harold T. Wilkins, a British author who compiled numerous accounts of the exploration of South America. According to Harold, in 1927, an expedition into the jungles led by Senor Medellin would find an area described as City Under the Mountains. It's here, he stated, they had ambushed and caught a dwarfish man about 4 foot tall with very red eyes, who had a thick bushy beard that reached down to his waist, and he wore a buckle made from solid gold. Medellin would go on to say that he met more of these pygmy people later on, and that they had dark colored white skin. But that wasn't even the most unusual part. That came when he started describing their red eyes, who Medellin described as being cat-like in appearance, specifically that they shine like a cat's eyes in the firelight. Now, going back to Wilkins, who was documenting this account, he would go on to say that his informant told him these dwarves lived in tunnels on the outskirts of the city, or they had rooms carved into the rock of the mountain, and most importantly, he noted they carried long curved knives made of pure gold. But getting back to Senor Medellin, he and his crew would leave the city underneath the mountain with as much gold as they could carry, and that's it. There's no closure left by Wilkins, so we don't know if they vanished like the other explorers, or if they quietly took their gold back and lived the rest of their lives as rich men. What's even more interesting in the tales of the so-called dwarves living in the holes cut in the mountain is in the last telegraph Percy Fawcett sent back to London. He specifically stated the City of Gold was guarded by a ferocious tribe of short, squat cannibals that lived in holes and caves on the outside of the city. Although he said they were armed with rocks and clubs, not golden knives, he also noted their great vision at night, citing they slept all day and stayed in their underground home until night, which kinda matches up with Senor Medellin's account of their red eyes glowing at night. But that's pretty much all we know about this expedition to this underground city in 1927. So what do we take from this? Is any of it true? I think the first thing we have to look at is the source. It was collected and put in a book by a man named Harold T. Wilkins. But who is he? As noted earlier, he researched and found many stories revolving around the exploration of South America, especially from the 19th and 20th centuries. But there's one issue with this. Wilkins was described by almost everyone in the scholarly world as a pseudo-historic writer. Anthropologist John Alden Mason pointed out that almost everything Wilkins has written has been proven incorrect, while an academic journal claimed his book, Mysteries of Ancient South America, was just total science fiction. Other scholars have said he was nothing but a crank. And maybe worst of all, he was known to plagiarize a lot of his material. So I mean, the source for this story is not the best. It's possible he just relayed common folklore he heard or read about from the area. Or it's even possible he straight up copied the material from another writer. The red disc tape is a mix of unexplained phenomena and lost media. The images you see here are allegedly of a red flying saucer that was recorded by two men in the Mojave Desert in 1994. It was recorded on a Hi-8 camcorder, which was a common camera at the time. They had recorded it while it was hovering or moving above their car. The two men are still unknown to this day, which stinks for UFO investigators because the whole case is deemed odd since most UFOs are metallic or gray in description, but this one was red. But the lost media part comes in because, well, the video is not available to the larger public. It's not technically lost, but instead kept in a private collection. Whose is unknown. but it's possible it's not being released due to the fear of ridicule or maybe fear of people attacking its legitimacy. The only thing available are these screenshots. Another reason it's deemed important though is the film has been reviewed by Royce Myers, a UFO researcher who is considered one of the more credible people in the field, because he is known for taking a more skeptical approach to UFO claims, and he deemed the footage authentic, which of course gives it a little bit more legitimacy and drives the interest in finding the original footage, with the UFO Watchdog Twitter account even making efforts to find the people who recorded it as late as 2022. Bob Lazar, one of the most controversial people in the UFO community, and part of that is due to the fact that, well, so many people believe him. His appearance on Joe Rogan alone garnered 61 million views, and considering Rogan later on said he believed him, well, that's all a lot of those 61 million people needed to hear to believe it too. But of course, as I mentioned, he is mired in controversy because he also has his fair share of skeptics, and a lot of these are in the UFO community. But what exactly has Bob Lazar claimed? Well, a lot of that is pretty well known, so I'm not going to spend too much time diving into it, but supposedly, he worked on a classified US government project that was tangled up in reverse engineering of extraterrestrial technology. According to him, he also read government briefing documents that described alien involvement in human affairs for over the past 10,000 years. He also claimed to have worked at a secret site near Area 51. And although several credible people have poked holes into his story over the years, as mentioned, he's still believed by a massive amount of people. And why is that? Well, for one, he's very convincing, but two, some of the stuff he has said over the years is actually true. And we don't have to discuss all those, but we'll take a look at the ones cited most often. One of these is an interview with George Knapp, whom Bob took around Los Alamos showing him around, and the people working there all seem to know Bob. Furthermore, his name can be found in the phone directory at this facility in 1982. Next, the Los Alamos newspaper featured a story on him and his jet car, which he drove, and labeled him as a physicist at the lab. Likewise, security personnel were seen by other people visiting Bob Lazar at his home, and friends and family all agreed that Bob would often disappear as part of his job. He was also able to describe certain aspects of facilities at Groom Lake, and he identified a location known as S4 in the Nellis Range complex. Even more telling, he was able to name specific people involved in the security process, and he received a W-2 form from the government. And there are witnesses who seen Bob intimidated by the government after the story broke. He also knew about the element 115 long before it was synthesized. Having said all that, we come to our topic, and obscure conspiracy theory for Bob Lazar. And I have to say, it actually makes a lot of sense. The theory comes from a man named Tom Mahood, who operates the website otherhand.org, and he has done extensive research on the Death Valley German case, a case where a family of 4 tourists from Germany vanished in Death Valley National Park in 1996, only for 2 of the adult members' remains to be found by a man named Les Walker and, of course, Tom Mahood, who had been searching the area. But I digress. It's Tom whose theory really kinda answers the whole Bob Lazar controversy. And while I just can't give the whole 9 yards of this really long post where he explains it, I will gloss over the boring parts and really dive into the more interesting ones. According to Tom, who has a master's in physics, he quickly would point out just how bad scientifically Bob's tale is. In other words, he would claim his ramblings were nothing but BS and not even worth being discussed. But getting to the more interesting parts about his theory, we start with Lazar's claims of seeing glowing objects over Groom Lake, which he inferred were UFOs. But according to Tom, they were really particle beams, which are a very real thing. And Tom would go on to speculate that part of the studies going on near Groom Lake at that time was radar measures and countermeasures, so it's possible they were using these particle beams to test radar spoofing. He follows this up by pointing out whatever they were working on there at the time is still classified, whether it be particle beams or heck, maybe something else altogether. But the point is that it's still classified today, which is a plus for Bob Lazar, who can claim whatever he wants, and the government can't come out and say, no, that's not what it is, because this is a secret program. Regardless, these glowing orbs showed up every Wednesday night in the skies over Groom Lake, but they were not UFOs or UFO technology. Instead, they were these plasmas generated by a high-powered proton accelerator shooting its beam into the atmosphere. But here's where we get to the meat of this theory. According to Tom, Bob knew all this. In his research, Tom discovered Bob got to Los Alamos sometime in the 80s and set up a photo processing business, and somehow he managed to get a limited-term contract with Kirk Meyer, and Kirk Meyer is a contract company supplying staff workers to Los Alamos lab, usually things like data entry personnel, machinists, and electronic technicians. This is important because Kirk Meyer never had any physicists, which Bob claims he is. Bob, however, did have an electronic technical education from Pierce College, so he got hired on as an electronic tech. And according to several witnesses that knew Bob and talked to Tom, he was a very clever fix-it guy, and it's true. He even got listed in their phone directory. And as far as the jet car he drove, that was true too. It was powered by a quirky device that burned propane and was noisy, and you could strap it to a bike or a go-kart, and apparently they even had one for a small car, and these plans were featured in many science magazines at the time, so it wasn't that rare. Regardless, the important part here is that this got the interest of a local newspaper which did a piece on Lazar, who told them he was a physicist at the lab, which was his first lie. But the crazy part is, the very next day, a man named Edgar Taylor, a famous theoretical physicist and chemical engineer known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, would happen to visit Los Alamos to give a lecture. That changed everything. According to Tom, while killing some time, Edgar Taylor began reading a local paper when he came across the story of Bob Lazar, and they described him as being a physicist, even though he wasn't. And Lazar, being a master of low-key self-promotion, began talking to Taylor while trying to impress him. If not for this, Lazar would still be an unknown. Fast forward a few years until 1985, and Lazar declares bankruptcy and relocates to Las Vegas after borrowing money from a ton of people in Los Alamos and not paying them back, which included some of his family. Anyways, after hanging around Vegas for a few years, he would write Edgar Taylor and say, "Hey, remember me? I'm the jet car physicist. I have lots of experience in particle accelerators. Do you know any interesting positions where I could put that to use?" By this time, Taylor was 80 years old and not as sharp as he had been, and he put in a word for Lazar, which got him an interview and got him another secret clearance job with the government at a facility called S4, near Area 51. Now what's crazy is they actually were going to look at giving him a secret clearance in spite of the fact that he had a bankruptcy record, which is unusual. Maybe this was because Taylor recommended him, or they simply overlooked it. But next, the security guys for the government would show up to Bob's home and check him out as part of the clearance, which is why witnesses said they seen him being visited by these agents. He soon got hired to do non-classified work while he waited on his clearance to update. Regardless, by now, he knew the facility was working on a top-secret proton accelerator at Groom Lake, as they fired it up every Wednesday night. And here is where Bob goofs up, according to Tom, because he starts inviting his friends out on Wednesday night to see the test, which again, were classified. Which begs the question, did Bob know his clearance check was going to fail, so he didn't care? Or was he trying to prank his friend, John Lear, whom he often made fun of for believing in UFOs? Maybe he was trying to impress them, or maybe Bob simply thought he was too smart to get busted. Regardless, Bob never told his friends or family the truth, which was, they really seen a proton beam, not secret UFO technology. By doing this, he was technically not violating his security agreement, although I guess maybe he was, by even bringing them to observe the test in the first place. But these friends that seen the UFOs, or really the proton beam, would become his most hardcore supporters because they really seen something. They just didn't know it wasn't really UFOs. But it didn't take long for this to blow up in Bob's face, because on April 5th, 1989, security discovered this group of party animals that like to get together and watch the UFOs/proton beam. Bob realized he screwed up and he took off, but the sheriff's department called his friends, who turned Bob in, and Bob is now potentially looking at prison time. The next day he is met by security, who are unsurprisingly grilling him, but that's when he tells them that he told his buddies that what they were seeing were flying saucers. This threw a curve to government security. Do they prosecute Bob and draw further attention to their secret proton operation? Or just kick him out and intimidate him to get him to not speak of it anymore? Well, they took the latter, and Bob became a folk hero, especially because of the work done by UFO researcher John Lear, who really promoted Bob's claims. Bob, meanwhile, only had one choice. He had to fully double down on all these stories he had told his friends. If he came clean about the whole thing, then that would mean he was giving over classified information, and old Bob would be in prison. So basically, no UFOs, instead just a guy making up stories to stay out of jail, and also getting paid to make appearances, do interviews, and even writing a book. Oh, and by the way, it's because of him being hounded by all these security personnel at the time that he could name some of them later on, which ufologists point to when they try to say his story is legit. And for the so-called claim that Lazar knew about element 115 before it was actually synthesized, well, that's wrong. Bob's original claim was that it was stable, which amazed people because no one knew this at the time, meaning he did work at that secret facility, except that's not true either. Actually, the same month that Bob divulged this in an interview in May 1989, yeah, that was the same month the Scientific American magazine published an article talking about the potential island of stability around 115, so probably not a coincidence. There are many other things that we could go on to point out here, like how he claims he has a master's degree from Caltech and MIT, yet those have basically been debunked too. For one, the subjects he claimed to have gotten masters in weren't even offered as classes at that time, and he at one point also gave the last names of 2 instructors at these schools. And that's another problem with all this, he rarely likes to give names. But anyways, these names couldn't be found at Caltech or MIT. Interestingly, these 2 last names that were supposed to be his instructors, well, one of them was found at Pierce College, where Lazar actually went, and the other was a teacher at the high school Bob attended. Not to mention, Bob has been arrested twice since all this, and one of those because he was pimping. No joke. So I mean, he doesn't have the best reputation anyways. Early 2023, Minya, Egypt. Archaeologists exploring an ancient cemetery would hit the jackpot when they came across a sarcophagi which contained amulets, ornaments, and mummies with rich designs, which may have not been much of a surprise, considering this was a graveyard thought to be for high-ranking officials and priests of the New Kingdom that reigned between 16th and the 11th century BC. But it's what they found inside that would soon go viral. Although it was discovered in early 2023, it would be the following summer of 2024 that someone on Reddit would notice a very odd resemblance between a figure on the sarcophagus and someone we know today. And if you look at it, you may already recognize it yourself. Yep, that's Marge Simpson on this 3,000-year-old lid to this tomb. The woman in question is of yellowish complexion, wears a green dress and a tall blue crown, which many have noted looks like Marge's dress and hair. This went viral after the Redditor pointed it out, and as you might imagine, this one is under the internet meme category. Although, I do have to point out here, even though it was this post in July 2024 that went viral, shortly after the discovery in early 2023, there was already people pointing out the similarities, but for whatever reason, it didn't go viral until this year. The real woman buried in this tomb is Toddy the First, and in spite of the jokes about ancient Egypt predicting the Simpsons, that's most likely not the case. Parapsychology is something we have touched on before in this series, and it's simply the study of alleged psychic phenomena including ESP, telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis. Ironically, although these are deemed pseudoscientific by the skeptical community, the US government actually put quite a bit of research into the topics during the height of the Cold War, so it shouldn't surprise you that the Soviet Union researched it as well. Although, as their research labored on into the 80s, they changed the term to psychotronics. Regardless, this just goes on to prove that both governments took the research very seriously, as both countries were convinced, or at least were hopeful, that they could come up with new ways to attack the enemy, or to spy on the enemy via entering their mind and reading their thoughts. And just like the US got a black eye from its research in MK Ultra, the Soviets also had these issues. And taking that, we're going to look at two different instances that could have possibly been tests related to psychotronics. The first is not only one of the most famous cases in the Soviet Union, but also in the world, the Dyatlov Pass incident. That's right, you know the story. In February 1959, 9 experienced hikers died under mysterious circumstances in the Ural Mountains of Russia. Their bodies would be found scattered across the area, some with strange injuries like a missing tongue and severe internal damage that did not have external wounds, while others died from hypothermia. The skeptical theories for this have ranged from avalanche to military testing. Heck, sometimes even Yeti is suggested. The case is very odd because the unusual injuries suggest they were panicked and running from something. The second strange case is the Kamar Daban incident, which we covered back on the second part of this series, if you're wanting to watch a more in-depth explanation. This one is similar to Dyatlov Pass, except it happened in 1993 and saw 6 Kazakhstani hikers die in weird circumstances in the Kamar Daban mountain range. And unlike Dyatlov, one person in this one survived, but similarly, they were disoriented and had unexplained injuries, which brings us back to the psychotronic theory. What if, in both instances, these disasters could be easier explained by some psychotronic weapon? I mean, in both cases, there was already the theory that the military was doing some kind of testing, although it's usually suggested it was nuclear testing or some kind of poison. But what if, instead, it was a psychotronic weapon? This theory is largely based on both groups' disorientation, sudden panic, and bizarre behaviors, and it suggests that there could have been these electromagnetic fields that these hikers in both cases walked through that caused the effects and slowly killed them, or caused them to panic in such a way that they caused their own demise. Likewise, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a field, but some kind of weapon like that. It could have been mind control or remote influencing. Is it possible a team working in these studies got into the minds of these people and made them act in the way they did? Others suggest the very real possibility of using sound waves, a la the Cuban sonic attacks we also previously covered, while others have suggested the Soviet military was using microwave or other forms of radiation to manipulate them or induce panic, where they could then study the effects in a controlled environment. This would explain how they had no external signs of injury, but still had internal trauma. And considering both locations were far from civilization, it allowed the military to conduct these tests in secret. Of course, the skeptics still point out there's no concrete evidence of any of these types of weapons being used in either incident, and more than likely, they died from natural phenomena. We sure have looked at many pseudoscientific claims and theories thus far, but this next one has to be one of the best. It is located on a website called stopabductions.com, and let me explain before you get the idea, this is about human-on-human abduction. Nope, this is about finally putting a stop to alien abductions. And this isn't just crazy talk, because the admin of the site, a Michael Minkin, has actually come up with a way to stop it, and it's called the Thought Screen Helmet. You see, Michael designs these helmets that actually prevent alien abductions. Now before you jump the gun and think this guy's a grifter, he's not. He's actually not making any money. He simply provides the instructions on how to build the helmet, and he even offers to make and send them to alien abductees absolutely free of charge, which is awful nice cause it takes nearly 4 hours to construct. He explains that even though these aliens are more technically and mentally advanced than us, they are still subject to the physical laws of the universe, and Michael, having worked with abductees for more than 25 years, was able to come up with a way to stop it. But he warns, an alien will try to stop you from wearing the helmet, and they will know if you're about to try because they can read your mind. And even if you put on this helmet, they will still harass you. They may even threaten to kill your pet in retaliation. Michael was also quick to point out that they may manipulate your spouse into having a conflict with you about wearing the helmet, which you have to admit is pretty clever. But if you do take it off, it may be over, because the aliens can then physically harm you. He also cautioned if you're not wearing the hat, they will go through your house and look for it, except they cannot get into a locked cabinet, so make sure to hide it there, or perhaps a locked trunk. It's because in a society where everyone is a telepath, locks are unnecessary, so it's like a foreign concept to them. Mike also warns, once you start making the hat, do it quick, because once the aliens find out what you're up to, they will try to stop you. After finishing it, make sure you tape it to your head so the aliens can't remove it. Also, don't let them lure you out of the home if you think they are nearby. They may try to spook you by banging on the walls or using lights outside to try and entice you. Next, if you live in a hot climate, over 80 degrees Fahrenheit, make sure to poke holes in the helmet. Finally, the most important instruction. Make sure you wear it frequently as possible, because abductees can even be taken when driving cars. If you're worried about how it looks, you can also take a baseball cap and put 8 sheets of Velostat, a packaging material made of polymeric foil, and put it into the hat, which looks a little less conspicuous. Some of the abductees Michael has worked with have worn their hats 24 hours a day for 20 plus years, and have not been abducted the whole time. And how exactly does this work? I know you're dying to know. Mike suggests it doesn't act as a shield. Instead, it simulates another brain activity which stops alien telepathy from being processed internally, which means it prevents the abductee's brain from converting alien telepathy into human thoughts. I think I'm just going to stop here and go to the next one. When it comes to haunted locations that have some kind of strange paranormal activity, maybe none are bigger than Skinwalker Ranch. However, did you know that there is a location in Wales that was subjected to similar activity? The story begins in 1979 at a location known as Ripperston Farm, which was owned by the Coombs family. The activity started strange enough and only got progressively more bizarre. The first record of unexplained phenomenon would be encountered by the wife, named Pauline, and it happened as she was driving home one night, when she would suddenly see a football-sized object behind her that seemed to be pursuing the vehicle. That would be followed up days later when her and her husband Billy were watching TV when they seen a silvery glow outside, which began to interfere with the television. Billy got out of his chair and walked over to the window to see a huge space-suited individual a few feet from the window. The man was described as being over 7 foot tall and wearing a one-piece silver aluminum suit, capped by a square solid-looking helmet with a black square visor. It didn't end there though, as they later seen a UFO in a field about 400 to 500 yards away. But we don't need to recap every one of these encounters. Instead, we are going to focus on the one that landed on this iceberg. As we move forward into this mystery, there were now 2 fields the Coombs family would not visit, along with their livestock, due to 2 different UFOs being sighted there. Because of this, their milk yield was down some 15%, so it was starting to hurt the farm. But something even crazier would happen. Billy was tending to the cattle in the milking complex when he decided to step out, go back in the house, and grab a cup of tea. So it was about midnight as he walked out and locked the shed and secured the bolted gate and walked in. As soon as he entered the living room, the phone rang and Billy answered it, and it was his irate neighbor who told Billy to get down to his house quick because his cattle were eating his crops. Billy was kind of stunned, but informed his neighbor that those could not be his cows because he had just locked them up in the shed less than a minute ago. His neighbor was insistent though, so Billy, trying to satisfy his angry neighbor, told him to wait while he walked out back to the shed and checked on them. And when he got there, all 158 cattle he had left in the shed, eating their hay, were gone. Billy couldn't understand it. How did they go from there all the way to their neighbor's farm in the amount of time it took him to walk back to the house? Not to mention, the gate was locked, and the neighbor's farm was a mile away. Billy had no choice but to apologize, and with his sons, went and herded up the cattle and took them back. Strange things would continue to happen over the years, but nothing quite as strange as the teleported cows incident. And it's really hard to come up with a theory as to what really happened, because of the short amount of time between Billy locking them up and walking back indoors. So let's tackle that first. If that's what really happened, then the cattle had to have been teleported by something. There's just no other way. But let's say Billy maybe lost track of time, then that really opens up the door to a prank. People in the area presumably knew Billy already thought the farm was haunted, and it's possible they could have decided to play a joke on him. Or the cattle may have escaped on their own if Billy did not really lock up like he thought he did. Either of those will work if Billy simply lost track of time. Otherwise, it had to be teleportation, or some kind of time slip, or a reality glitch, or something like that. Can a video game be conscious? That's what our next fringe theory sets out to answer, which argues Super Mario Bros. From 1985 is conscious. Now before I get started, I have to state ahead of time, I'm drawing heavily from the video of another creator's channel simply named Harold, which I will link in the description below, because it's his video that is actually linked on the Iceberg, but it's this video that explores this strange theory. If you have played the original Super Mario, you will no doubt remember the secret area that players could access in World 1-2 by using the game's mechanics. If you remember, you can hitch a ride on one of those moving platforms, jump up on the bricks, run forward where it would appear nothing should be, then you drop down into an area with 3 pipes, allowing you to transport to further ahead in the game, even bypassing half the levels. Like I said, almost everyone knows that one, but you may not know about World -1, which comes by the result of a glitch. It's basically the spot where the game's collision detection fails to load the correct area, and it sends players to an endless looping underwater level, which is a bit eerie because there's no exit, outside of Mario dying, that is. And since this was something that happened outside the developer's control, and they didn't even know about it until the game came out, it makes it a little bit more unpredictable, like it's not fully under the control of a human, suggesting that World -1 is an example of a game seemingly having some control of itself. And that's where we get to the point. Is it possible that glitches are sort of like the game's subconscious, just as we have a subconscious that generates ideas and imagery without conscious control, aka dreaming? A video game might be capable of generating new content via glitches without any input from the game's designer. So yeah, pretty interesting concept, but I'm not really sure if video games have a conscious, or electronics in general, but check out the video on Harold's channel for a better explanation. And that brings us to the end of part 10 of the Obscure Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg Explained. We have just finished Layer 3 and are entering Layer 4. I hope you all enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.